Yeah, anyway, so good luck and looking forward to your talk.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for attending our lecture series tonight. This is our final lecture in our summer series program, and it's another great one that we have in store for you. So tonight, Dr. Mark Schurr, Professor Emeritus of Notre Dame in Anthropology, he's going to present on archaeological evidence of French activities in northern Indiana, where it is the fur trade. That's what we're all about, right? Fort St. Joseph, fur trade, yeah? Yeah, okay, thank you for visual confirmation. Okay, so welcome, Dr. Schurr, please proceed, and thank you so much to everyone that's joining us in person and online.
Thanks, Erica. So the topic, I know this series is to talk about kind of the resurgence of the fur trade after the 1720s and the brief period in there. And that's not really the area or time period that I work in. So I'm trying to give more of a broad, but I am incorporating those ideas. I had to learn a little bit more about it in my own work. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But, one of the questions that we think about it, we pay a lot of attention to Fort St. Joseph, and the fur trade looms big in everybody's imagination in this area, even if you're not familiar with the fort or with archaeology even. But it's kind of strange, really, because here's this early fort that we think of as prominent, and yet this is not a French area, right? Niles is not a French town. We don't think of ourselves as descendants of the French, and so it's this French system is very, very different than what we would have thought of. You would expect to happen, right? Because you expect a French community to grow up, and other than like the names of streets and parks and things like that, or schools, there's very little. Like I live on Marquette Avenue, famous, priest and explorer, but that's about our connection with Marquette in South Bend. So I'm going to talk a little bit about if we had more evidence, and most of the evidence we have about the fur trade era in this region, and I mainly just started in northern Indiana, is where I do most of my work, but I think you could include southwestern Michigan in this. It's mainly from Fort St. Joseph. Right? But if people were living at Fort St. Joseph, trading goods with Native Americans who were living in the area, and the French did try to get Native Americans to live by their forts, where is the other evidence of what was going on? And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. Where is it? And if we had it, what would it look like? If we had more of it? Because we do have some. It's sparse, but if you start to look for it, you can see it. So, we think about the first French in Indiana happening in southwestern Lower Michigan and in Niles in the St. Joseph Valley, happening in 1679, when LaSalle came through up the St. Joseph River and did the portage into the Kankakee and then went down toward the Mississippi. That's a famous area, and it shows where his portage was in South Bend. Clearly a lost opportunity for South Bend to have a fort. Clearly LaSalle put his fort more closer to the Sauk Trail at that time. But this is when we think of the French, really when the historic period really started. And then we had before that the pre-contact. And it's always hard to find a name for this era, So really the French historic period had been going on for a long time before LaSalle ever came to Niles, what's now Niles. So there's kind of gray area in between that often people call the proto-historic. And that's an area that I've been looking at, an era around, maybe late 1500s through the 1600s, early 1600s is an area I've been researching pretty intensively for the past almost 10 years now. And so this is kind of the start of this, but I've got this map here, and it shows different things like here's the Miamis are living on a river on this map. There's the Lac d'Illinois, and here's the River Miami. The Miami are in the area. Here is Lake Chicago. There's Fire Nations over here, various other places. There's a mission up here. So this is supposedly about a 1720s map of what the French thought was going on. A little bit different names gives you a sense about who might have been there at that time when they made the map, if they were right and they knew what they were looking at. But we know that people were here quite a bit earlier. So before the French, there's a prehistoric culture that's well known in the upper Mississippi, often called Upper Mississippian for its region, but also called Oneota for a site on the Oneota River in Iowa. And this site these people appear in the late 1300s. They make characteristic pottery crushed with tempered, where crushed shell, burnt crushed shell was mixed in with the pottery. They decorated their pottery in characteristic ways. And it's mainly through their pottery that we recognize these cultures. Their stone tools and other artifacts look pretty similar to what people in other parts are using. Now in our own area, in the St. Joseph Valley, the Kankakee, Des Plaines, there was a culture called Fisher-Huber, which is a kind of an eastern variety of Oneota. And there's long been a discussion or a controversy about where this fits, who these people were, and where they fit into the Oneota world. Some people think that Fisher-Huber was the ancestors of the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk. Other people thought the Miami. I don't think we really know on this answer, but there were a lot of native peoples living in the areas before the French came in there, before we have a historic record. What we do not have in this area with Fisher-Huber, typically people have figured out, we have these pottery styles that we use to trace these cultures. And often in some areas, people have been able to link these up, pottery up, and I'll talk about this later, with a specific named tribal group. Like a really great example is along the Mississippi in Missouri, Marquette, and Joliet stopped at a village that they described. It's by the Arkansas River. Maybe it was Arkansas. They talked about where they were at. They gave a really clear description of where they stayed. Of the people there, we'll call a variety of the Illinois group, Illinois, and they describe it, and archaeologists have gone and found a site in that location producing artifacts of the same time period, and they feel like they found the village that Marquette and Joliet visited, the Hayes Hagerman site. So that is what's called the direct historical approach, where you can link a site with historic documents and look at the material culture there. We don't have anything like that for Fisher-Huber. And that is kind of the gold standard for me for making a connection. So we really don't know. But we know how they were living. We know a fair amount about that. Because there are a lot of sites in the region that are Fisher-Huber sites. I'm going to talk about the Middle Grant Creek site that's in red there, but there are other sites as well. Some are earlier, like the Fisher site is a little earlier in time. Griesmer is later. There's a site called Collier Lodge I'm going to talk about in northern Indiana that was occupied off and on for 9,000 years. It has a little bit earlier variety of this Fisher-Huber at it, but it also produces some fur trade material. And then around Chicago, there's a whole group of sites that produce what's called Huber, the late part of this stuff, with a distinctive pottery. And some of this pottery is also found over in Moccasin Bluff and at other sites like Griesmer along the Kankakee. So people were living in the Chicago area, and they would use this entire region. They're clearly familiar with the Portage and the Niles area and going up to Moccasin Bluff near Buchanan. So this is, and we've been working, I work with a colleague of mine, Maddie McLeister. Terry Martin's come out and helped us at a site called Middle Grant Creek, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is Middle Grant Creek. It's located in Medewan National Tallgrass Prairie. It was originally the Joliet Arsenal, and in the 1980s, they decommissioned it and made it into a prairie. It was originally a prairie. So by making it a prairie again, they're trying to return it to its kind of historically recorded natural state. But this part of the site had these big like pyramid things. These were bunkers to store TNT. So they were widely spaced, so if like one blew up, it wouldn't take out the rest of them. And then nobody was allowed in there because it's full of like highly explosive TNT. So on one hand, you've got the arsenal, and parts of it have had really intensive industrial development, but in this part, they built these bunkers that were widely spaced and then let nobody in there. It was really great for site preservation. And when they started to establish the prairie, they began to inventory the sites. And they found a site that produced Huber phase pottery. And Maddie and McLeister and I got interested in this. We were looking for a Huber phase site to work on. So we went out there, and for over a 5-year period, we did 4 years of excavation in partnership between Notre Dame and the Forest Service. And you can see there, you can see the bunker field, and the main site area is this area up in here. And you can see where we've got the grass stripped off, and you can even see some of our excavation units from this drone photo. But the site produces a lot of data. The main feature we find are these really deep pits that are about 1 meter in diameter, 3 feet in diameter, and 2 meters or more, 6 feet or more deep. And they're chock full of garbage. These were pits to store corn. So they would store corn in them in the fall, and then in the spring, when food was scarce, and over the winter, they would dig them out, and then they'd have a big hole that over the course of maybe a year, they would fill with garbage. So we're looking at all the garbage that they threw in these pits, and you can see a lot of animal bones up here, some shells, ash, and the preservation in these pits was fabulous. We get even little tiny fish scales, all kinds of botanical remains. They tell us a lot about what was going on at the site. The artifact assemblage is really characteristic of very late Huber. The characteristic pot, kind of a globular vessel with thin scratched lines on it, out-flaring rim, little notches on the rim, loop or strap, usually strap handles. There are some other styles that show up, but mainly this is it, and then triangular arrow points that look the same as arrow points that are used all over eastern North America, right, for a long period of time. So this is the kind of pottery we knew we definitely had a Huber phase site when we started getting good pottery from it. And these sherds are not big necessarily, like the ones on the upper left, but they're distinctively, you can tell right away that is Huber pottery. So that's probably a sherd about that big. And other artifacts we found, for example, here's some antler stuff, a worked antler, probably a digging stick tool, an arrowhead, a little bone gaming piece, but also we found small pieces of copper or copper alloy metal that were in these pits as well. And that then becomes very interesting because you can use that for, so the question is where do they come from? And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but basically, were they trade goods, copper or brass trade goods, or were they native copper that were made by native copper Americans? And by looking at the composition of the metal, we can get an idea whether we're looking at native production or imported material, and even from Europe, and even from what time period roughly it was imported. So these trade goods come in, these metal goods come in, and beads are also important, but we did find one bead, which was pretty useful, but they're pretty scarce. So we found these little things, and you look at these things, they're pretty much scraps, right? They're little tiny scrap pieces, a little roll bead, and then a little part of a copper ring. It's not like we're finding like whole kettles or things like that. These people do not have a lot of access to metal. So from that makes us think it's early. But was it pre-European or pre-contact or post-contact? We don't know. So here's some stuff from Collier Lodge site that I mentioned. We don't have any Huber pottery from Collier Lodge. But we have bigger trade artifacts. We've got a tinkling cone, a cone made out of copper alloy or copper, a part of a bracelet, a little embossed copper thing, and then there's some silver on the right that probably dates to later. That's more characteristic of the British and American fur trade era, although some silver was coming in probably earlier. So a tinkler and stuff. So if you look at this, here's kind of a time frame going on the left from beginning with the late woodland, 8700, and prior to about 1580, native copper was the only kind of copper that Native Americans had access to. And that goes back thousands of years. That red arrow goes down for thousands of years. And this native copper was picked up in pure nuggets, either from the glacial deposits or up in Lake Superior. It crops out like on Isle Royale and other places. People would mine it and then form it into artifacts and trade it all around the place. So that native copper was in use by Native Americans. So if you find some copper at a prehistoric site, it's not that big of a deal in some ways. But around 1580, a new kind of copper comes in called smelted copper. And this is when on the east coast of Canada, fishermen are coming from the Basque area and from Normandy in Spain, northern Spain, northern France, coming in and fishing on the cod banks, and maybe doing some whaling. The Basque were whaling too. And they're starting to trade with Native Americans. And one thing they traded were these smelted copper kettles. They were copper kettles that were made by melting copper and casting it. Now, the native copper is super pure, has hardly any impurities in it. The smelted copper has impurities in it. So if you could look at the chemistry of the metal, you could tell whether it was native or smelted. And then after that, after about 1610, around when you start to see brass become more predominant. And brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. So it's a little bit different yet. And then after about 1765, silver becomes increasingly more important to the fur trade. So we have these periods. So for a Huber phase site, we can see a Huber phase site might produce native copper, it might produce smelted copper, or it might produce brass. So what are these things? So here's 1679 when the historic period begins. But you can see that there's a potential for European artifacts to come in before the historic period starts. So we have these 3 coppers. Well, we use X-ray fluorescence to look at these artifacts. And to do that, you use an instrument, a spectrometer. It looks like a refrigerator, but it's got a little tube in it that generates X-rays. And there's a platform in there. You put your sample on it, and it puts a little X-ray beam onto your sample, and that beam excites the elements in it, and each element emits its own characteristic X-ray, to oversimplify. And you can detect those secondary X-rays and tell what chemicals were there. So you can imagine if the main X-ray is like a light, super powerful light, you shine it on the object, and each chemical emits its own color, own X-ray, and the intensity of that color is how much is there. So a very powerful technique. So here's a little comparison. So here on the left is pure copper. So pure copper produces one main peak and a couple of other minor peaks. I mean, ideally each element would make one peak, that'd be nice, but the physics of it is not that simple. There's always these other peaks. And then there's brass on the right, and you can see once again, here's the 2 copper peaks, and here are 2 zinc peaks. So from right away, we can differentiate copper, which would be like native copper, and brass very easily with this method. And there I'm looking at the sample, and it's hard to see. There's a little tiny green dot there. That is where I'm actually measuring. It's like we can look at different parts of the artifact too, which can be pretty fun. So this is a good technique for looking at metals. You can use it, talking to Erica about using it to look at glass, other types of things, pottery decorations, beads. This is important for looking at things like beads. What kind of things their chemistry can also be used to date beads. So here's some smelted copper. So we looked at that tinkler I showed you earlier. That's from a site called Collier Lodge. I thought, no big deal, it's probably brass. But it turns out that is made of smelted copper. So right away you can see the copper peak. There's no zinc. Here's ZNK for the zinc. No zinc peak at all there. But then for the trace elements, we've definitely got trace element peaks going on there. So that is definitely smelted copper. So this was probably procured sometime between 1580, maybe a little earlier. People argue about exactly when, but in the late 1500s, and then probably before 1610, 1620s. So that was a surprise for me. I wasn't expecting to find that because this is prehistoric records, right? So somebody was living on the Kankakee River in Porter County, Indiana, and probably and almost certainly through down the line trade, obtained this copper tinkler or the smelted copper to make it from somebody that was on the East Coast that was in contact with the French, and just passed these things down the line to local people. So like Middle Grant Creek, we know, from that site, we have a good idea of that site. We did a lot more work on it. We know it was a village of about 150 people. that probably lived there for about 10-year period. About smaller number of people, bigger village, based on how much corn they had, the size of their houses and stuff. But so there were villages like that, all through the area. Probably off and on. Certainly in the Chicago area, smaller things on the Kankakee. I personally think they were living mainly in the Chicago area, and they were coming down seasonally on the Kankakee to use the Kankakee Marsh, and then sometimes coming over to Niles. But who knows? I mean, we did not know about this Middle Grant Creek site until the 90s, right? There could be other sites like this out there we just haven't heard about. But you can see that even if we found one of these sites in a field, and we found pottery from the Huber pottery crunched up and laying in the plow zone, it wouldn't be very likely that we'd find these little copper things. They're really puny. And if we did find them, we might just think they were like field trash, right? We wouldn't know what they were. So it's really important to use excavation to find and identify these things. So here's a brass tinkler, yep. So this is another tinkler. This one's from Middle Grant Creek. Here you can see a brass tinkler, and it's got brass and copper, and it's got a lot of impurities in it. So, this is a really solid brass thing. It's a little bit later than the Collier Lodge smelted tinkler. There you can see where the zinc peak is that we key in on. So once again, just looking at this, so we were able to go at Middle Grant Creek. We had a bunch of radiocarbon dates, like 20. Radiocarbon dates are not very useful for the late prehistoric time period. They have a lot of error in them. And we tried Basing modeling, and they gave even worse answers, But we then used this program to model the most probable results. The radiocarbon dates were like kind of two-part. Like they were in two humps. I don't know if you know about radiocarbonate calibration, but they made it into two probable. You'd like to have one hump that would be the date with some error on it. We had like two humps because they're like wiggling the curve. Well, we put this copper in the equation, and we will find out that, okay, we're really on the later part, and we could find out that Middle Grant Creek dated to 1600 in the middle, middle part of Huber. So a good solid lifetime before LaSalle came into the area. Native Americans were getting French trade goods in the Chicago region and in this region too, and probably trading stuff like at Middle Grant Creek. We find a lot of fur-bearing remains, a lot of muskrat, a little bit of beaver, mink, a lot of stuff. So this fur trade probably started off in this little exchange, Native American to Native American, of local products, probably furs, going out for little scraps of copper coming back in, just down the line, right? And probably given as like gifts, gift exchange, heavily embedded within the indigenous cultural framework before it became kind of more, commodified. So before even, at the early part, before St. Joseph even gets a chance to get established, we have later French forts, for Crèvecoeur down at Fort St. Louis, near Starved Rock, Fort Chicago, Fort Miami, all these things, late 1600s. Before that, 1640, you had the Iroquois Wars that totally depopulated Michigan and northern Indiana, and then moved everybody back. And then it was the settlement after that, as the French came back in, as these Iroquois were pacified, you start to see the French come back in and reestablish these settlements like Fort St. Joseph and many others in the area. And Wiatnan on the Wabash as well. So these things were probably disruptive, and certainly by the late 1600s, we have the Miami and the various Illinois spread across the Illinois prairies, and we have very good description of Illinois at St. Louis, at Starved Rock, near Utica, and their material culture. It does not look like Huber. It produced, so here's stuff from Starved Rock, where LaSalle also had a fort that he founded that was more prominent. And you can see this is very different. There's different kinds of pottery. So there's pottery on the left that people think looks like Shawnee, and we know Shawnee were there. There's pottery on the bottom that I don't know if anybody's really associated with anybody. This knot stuff shows a lot at these Illinoisan sites shows up a lot. So this is a complicated situation where it looks like if you think pottery is associated with ethnic groups, it's a multi-ethnic community. Now at Middle Grand Creek, we've got mainly this other Huber pottery. We found one rim sherd that had that kind of collar, notch collar on it. So they were in contact with somebody from probably from Illinoisan peoples, but a very limited example of that. We didn't have any of the Shawnee type pottery or this other weird stuff, which we haven't really associated with. But it's, ideal. So there's some type of native pottery that would be in this area. Now, exactly what it looks like, we do find Huber stuff. It was probably Huber. It gets then maybe hybridized with some more other pottery coming from the north that's often associated with more northern Algonquian tribes. So it's a really complicated era of populations moving in response to this Iroquois for these wars. And then when that's pacified, of all moving back in again on the other side of the lake. Once it's okay, you can come back around the lake. And then bringing your different styles with you and making a lot of multi-ethnic villages. As you get more contact, you get more disease and population disturbances. So it's very difficult to understand what's going on just with the pottery alone. So there's recently a book came out on Fort Wiatnan. Missy Jackson and Dan Cooper have looked at this. Here's a map I took from a chapter in 2024. But it shows kind of, they've got the native tribes that are known to be in Indiana around the 1700s. Wiatnan, 1717 is founded. Fort Miami, what is now Fort Wayne, 1722. And post Vincennes in 1733. And makes this kind of axis of fur trades. There's a little thing called the Le Petit Fort. Has anybody heard of that? You've heard of that? You've heard of that? Okay, I'll talk about that in a minute too. That's a really interesting site. But there's this kind of a series of fur trade sites, and just like Fort St. Joseph, most of them had little impact on the subsequent Frenchness of the area. Right? Fort Wayne is not French at all. Quickly became British. Fort Wiatnan, well, it's out in the country, right? Which is why it's so well preserved, right? And West Lafayette grew up there. And then post Vincennes, actually, has a little French thing going on there, but it's not particularly French now. Michael Strzelecki has done work at Miami, looking for Fort Miami, and Vincennes, looking for post Vincennes, with almost no luck at all. And just no luck. Fort Wiatnan's a totally different story. These two urban sites in Vincennes and Miami, just like with Fort St. Joseph, they were all in what later became cities. Wiatnan's out in the country. But on Fort St. Joseph is lucky because at the other two, it appears like they did substantial development, urban development, on top of the forts. Now, there might be some in one park in Fort Wayne, the post there, Fort Miami, part of that. There's like multiple Fort Miamis. But one of the parks might be in a park, just like here, down by the river, but they put like 15 feet of fill over it. So even worse than our little garbage dump, right? So it's very difficult to investigate this site. And it's a real treasure to have a site like Fort St. Joseph that's accessible and has people committing to working with it and interpreting it. So, but there's, not only, most of this, there's a guy, Bert Anson, that wrote a dissertation in 1953 about the fur trade in northern Indiana, the entire fur trade. And his theory is that these forts along here, along the Wabash, became important because the Fox Wars disrupted things along Lake Michigan and up into Wisconsin, cutting off kind of the route of the upper St. Maybe not so much as St. Joseph. On the other hand, it's hard to see on this map. I apologize for that. But there are little lines going along here, and there's a line that went from Fort St. Joseph, like a trail that went. There's a portage here with many lakes. There was a trail that went between these forts, and another one that went down to Fort Wayne and went to Vincennes. So, there was definitely communication by land through amongst these different forts too, not just the Wabash versus the St. Joe. These are all part of a kind of somehow complicated, connected network. But we don't really have, for all the excavation and CRM work that's been done, sites from this area, except besides these forts where people have looked at it, very hard to give you the name of one. Collier Lodge is an example in Indiana. Hard to think of one in Michigan. I don't know, maybe somebody knows one. Very hard to find these things. Well, why is that? I think it's mainly because of the visibility of the sites. So let's take a look. So if the fur trade is going on really big between 1721 and 1738, why aren't we finding like trade goods everywhere, right? Well, let's look at the trade goods. So here's from Dean Anderson's dissertation. This doesn't include Fort St. Joseph, unfortunately, but he looks at significant fur trade posts: Detroit, Green Bay, Michilimackinac, and Weontanon, and goes through their trade books through part of this period and inventories the items that were sold and how much they were worth as an index of their relative volume. If you look at this, number 1 was cloth, blankets were number 2, shirts were number 3, gunpowder, number 4, and capotes, which was a kind of a cloth cape, or brandy, was number 5. So we don't know the same records exactly, or maybe you guys do now, but I'm not aware of them from Fort St. Joseph, but they're probably kind of similar. All these things are perishable. Now you might think the brandy came in bottles. I don't know. If it came in casks, they could have been parceling it out in gourd jugs or leather bags or even native pots. And we wouldn't really see that on a site. Maybe they were just drinking it all up by the trading posts. We don't know. To make this more complicated, hang on, I just want to read my notes here. So the kind of trade goods that might show up: brass items like hawk bells, little tiny bells that were popular, gun flints, glass beads, and all the other imperishable trade goods. The small trade made up a very small portion of the trade value. And so there's a lack of visible goods, and the ones that are there are really small. And I think that's what makes it so hard to find these outlying fur trade sites. Another problem is that we had the coureurs de bois, right? The illegal or unlicensed traders, who by definition very few of them were documented for good reasons. They were not, they were people that were interested in a Native American related lifestyle, but they weren't interested in being, written down by somebody at a fur post, right? Or getting arrested. So that whole part, we don't have a historic record on this stuff that's going on during this era, outside of the main posts by and large. So, from these sites, we can look at, here's Collier Lodge, Middle Grand Creek. So these are two sites that produce artifacts like smelted copper and brass that date to this fur trade era, earlier pre-French settlement fur trade, and then even French settlement fur trade. So we've had these sites, and on both those sites, we know about them because we did extensive excavations over multiple years using screening and water flotation to collect the artifacts. Now there is one more site I was reading through CRM reports from northern Indiana, just looking for brass, right? And looking for Huber or anything like that. There was some work in Lake County where they excavated a site and they found a couple of features they thought might be Huber, but they didn't really find any pottery. They found plain pottery. They didn't find the characteristic decoration. But in one feature, they found what they called a piece of copper. But it'd be interesting to take the ad and use XRF on it and see if it's copper or smelted copper or brass. But there's another site that does show up in cultural resource management reports that are being done all the time that shows there are other of these sites present. Unfortunately, the rest of that site, they were like kind of salvaging it, and it was ruined by a gravel pit. So much for that one. That happens a lot. So here's a Collier Lodge. Collier Lodge, we worked on this thing down by the Kankakee. It's a very complicated site. It's been kind of like here where you have this kind of public archaeology. We've worked with the Kankakee Valley Historical Society over 20 years total, but not every year, maybe 14 years in the field, excavating the site. The dark gray features are prehistoric or pre-contact. The light features are the historic era features. And this it has stuff going back to 11,000 years ago. Most of the pre-contact features are late Fisher, so they're not even Huber. And the historic stuff ranges from kind of contact 1820s, American pioneer, American pioneer, up through the Civil War, and even people lived in this thing up until the 80s. So there's a lot of archaeology on this site. And here's a little unit we did. You can see on the right, there's one that goes down really deep, over 2 meters deep, and it's got kind of sloping sides, and it's got bricks in it. That was the side of probably like a root cellar for a cabin that was there. And where it caved in. Then next to that, there's a pit that has a bunch of red and black in it. That was a late Fisher roasting pit for roasting plant roots. And somebody dug that out and then filled it in, dug it out again, and made an earth oven in there with rocks to roast something. Took that out when they got the roasted thing out, refilled it back in. And next to this big mess of stuff, we found a couple of French era trade goods. Kind of like very like native versions of like Spall type gunflints. That would be the earlier type of gunflint present. And then a tinkler, that's a brass tinkler, and then a brass, what's called a hawk bell. So at this, we have never found any features at Collier Lodge, which means like an actual dirt stain that meant something. You know, that had artifacts in it, like a post mold. Or if you visit the fort, you'll see features can be even as simple as a organized pile of rocks indicating a building foundation. Or a dark soil stain full of artifacts from people throwing trash out. We have not found any of these artifacts in feature context. They're all mixed in with later artifacts because people dug there and messed it all up. You know, we don't have the nice, clean stuff you have at Fort St. Joseph. But we do see that definitely at this, maybe just before Fort St. Joseph, or maybe, do you get these kind of gunflints at Fort St. So maybe even the same time. These artifacts here could have come from trading with Fort St. Joseph, or traders from Fort St. Joseph, which I think is pretty interesting, that we could actually see some of that down on the Kankakee. So let me talk about Le Petit Fort up by Lake Michigan shore. This thing shows up in historic records. And a lot of times it's just all in folklore. But there's a group that does reenactments, kind of the Sons, and they have probably the best webpage. It's like the most carefully considered webpage on this thing that tells a lot about it. But anyway, in 1780, so supposedly there's this Petit Fort that shows up. Like in 1780, Fort St. Joseph was raided by a party from Cahokia. Everybody knows about that, right? Captained by a French-Canadian who fought on the American side in the Revolution. Okay? The raid disrupted the fort, but then the raid party got chased by British forces from Detroit. And they eventually caught up with them and killed several of the raiding party near we have a letter from the British saying, hey, here's what happened. We went and we chased them and we caught them near Le Petit Fort. And we killed like whatever number of them and captured a few. So this is just one of the few written references. And people have long thought that it was in the Indiana Dunes State Park. But this is one of the few primary documents. And it's really kind of just an enduring mystery. Where was it and where was it located? It doesn't really show up as French documents as a fort or a post. So we don't think it was a formal French post. People think maybe that it was a place where they had like someplace like a little fortified blockhouse or cabin even that you could store your goods in, and kind of just a little area, kind of a staging area or something like that. If you read about Fort St. Joseph, even that fort was not like spectacular, right? This was probably even less spectacular. But very few, there's local oral traditions. I said like the Les Habitants de Petit Fort. That's a group of reenactors, and they portray life in 1755. And it appears in only 3 historic documents dating the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So nothing really contemporary with the fort. And one's this British letter describing the battle. Oops, I'm sorry. So I was looking at this thing, and people think that it was maybe located, lost my cursor. Located near the mouth of Trail Creek at the dunes, right? So at the top, there's the mouth of Trail Creek in 1927. I look at that as an archaeologist and I say, ooh, lots of archaeological potential, right? There's these dunes. There's just a little bathhouse. There's an outhouse. Looks like a good place to work. Well, when you start to, by 1930, they built the Indiana Dunes State Park. And what they did was they built a bathhouse that was on top of the creek and covered it, and then put a parking lot off to the west, which is probably like the best place you would put the fort, right? So, I mean, it'd be hard to find this site, even if nobody had ever built anything there. It'd be hard to find this site. I looked, for example, there's a guy, John Baptiste DuSable, that was one of the founders of Chicago. The Haitian person, he lived in Michigan City and he had a cabin in Michigan City. And I'd done some archaeology there was on a big dune. Well, if you look into dune archaeology, it's very difficult because these dunes are like constantly moving. So you'd have to do some radar, stuff like that. They did some expansion to the bathhouse area, and they did some cultural resource management. They put one core about this big in diameter down into the ground. They didn't find anything, which you would not be surprised. Additionally, there was a thing called City West in the early 1800s that was here, where somebody tried to found a city, a little town, but that went defunct. And it's probably buried under the sand too. But this is the kind of stuff that's frustrating for looking at fur trade era sites. Here'd be a really great site, actually documented, good oral tradition where it's at, but likely to be destroyed. And then we get to, pretty much the end of this. I'm going to talk a little bit, really briefly. It's interesting, though. You would think that the French were removed at the end, 1765. The French would be expelled. Britain has control over the area, but and the French influence is gone. That's why Niles isn't French, and eventually this all turns into big parts of the United States. But there's this period, the removal period, 1795 to 1840, when Native Americans were being removed. And it's an interesting time because it's the very end of the actual fur trade that started off with this French fur trade, so resurgent in the 1720s, 1730s, 40s. But in this period, there's a lot of change. You went from, at the earliest part, and through this, you had Tecumseh and organized Native resistance to Western American incursions. By the end, Jackson was president and wanted to get rid of all Native Americans. So there's a really drastic change in that period, from Native political autonomy to complete control and even expulsion by the American government. It's also a time of really rapidly changing material culture. Some of this stuff is from Pokagon Village. Some of it's from a site called McCartney Cabin site. That's a fur trader site in Kosciuszko County. But you can see there's various gun flints and mixture of stone and pottery pipes. Sound familiar? And beads, all kinds, and pottery and stuff, and metal goods that's happening this. But who's selling this stuff? By and large, it is people that come in at the end of the removal period. They are largely French. Joseph Bailey, who's French and has a native wife, settles Bailey Homestead, where I also worked. We found nothing relating to the fur trade there either, late fur trade even. That site went through a lot of stuff. But Bailey started a homestead there. There's a Le Petit Fort. Joseph Bertrand on the bottom left there, part native fur trader that lived at Bertrand, just south of Fort St. Joseph. Pierre Navarre, who was the first non-native settler of St. Joseph County and of South Bend. He was French, of French extraction. So all these fur traders, by and large, Coquillard or Coquillard, also French extraction. These people that came in, often in most of the counties, the earliest settlers are French people who have come in for the very end of this fur trade. They're Canadians or Canadian Americans, French Americans that are coming into this area and keeping this fur trade tradition alive. You also have other people like mainly Coquillard and Lathrop Taylor. The men on the left and Navarre all took Indian wives. just as the Coureur de Bois probably did, and the other early French fur traders did. Native American wives, which was actually it was an entry into the native society. It was also, in the removal period, it was financially smart because almost always these wives got land in treaty settlements that then could be sold off. Like that was Bertrand's plan, was to get his wife's treaty settlement land that he could then start a city, because the fur trade declined. Most of these people moved to land speculation and trying to found cities. Or off on other, or they went with removal. In Navarre's case, he removed with the Potawatomi, with his family. Coquillard and Taylor, though they were equipping people like this, the French, to go out and do the work, and they stayed, and they mainly got their money off the fur trade. They quickly changed to land speculation, platted what became South Bend, and then went off and used that money to build a lot of other businesses. So this French fur trade, so important in the 1700s and exemplified around St. Joseph, really then reverberates over the next century and a half to set the landscape of who's going to settle the area and how it's going to be developed, 150 years later. So with that, I think I'll stop there, and I had a lot of help on this. A lot of people have worked on this project, a lot of acknowledgments. I can't really read all their names, and many more that probably aren't on this slide. But if you have any questions or we have time for that, I'd be glad to answer questions.
Do we have any questions to start off?
Yes.
Go ahead, Zeke.
So you said, mentioned at the end there, that a lot of these...
Thanks a lot, Zeke.
You said at the end there that a lot of these who were involved with the fur trade also moved into land speculation and also married strategically and politically for land settlements as well. And you said a lot of them were like looking found towns and stuff. What was usually like the success rate of like trying to found a town like that?
Close to zero. The only one of the native married speculators none of them succeeded. Well, Navarre, but he didn't really found South Bend. It was the people that came in after him and would kind of hire him. Like Bertrand, his town didn't work. Bertrand, Michigan, right? Just south of here, there's a road called Bertrand. There was a town called Bertrand. If you go down from the fort and go down, 3rd Street?
Yeah.
3rd Street, and you go down to Bertrand Road, that's where the town of Bertrand was. So there was a little town that grew up there, but that town was mainly post-Bertrand, but it failed. There's no town there now, it's just some houses.
How did they fail?
They just couldn't get people to settle there, right? Like Bailey had a good plan, settle between Chicago and Niles on the Sauk Trail, but he didn't attract he didn't have, in his case, I think, he was just on the trail. The places that were successful had access to water and land routes. So Bertrand should have succeeded, but I think just got outcompeted by people that settled Niles, which had already had a community with the French there before. I think each one would be an individual story. But yeah, poor success rate. But there's a lot of people that there's a million ghost towns all over the Midwest where people try to start a town and the railroad went 2 miles south and those towns are gone. Or maybe they're just like a grain elevator or something now.
Bertrand, among other things, got bypassed by the Michigan Central Railroad or whatever it was called at the time.
Yeah, later that would be the death knell.
Yeah.
I see you have up there with the Wildlife Park and Mike Stephen. I know Mike, we passed away, but did you guys do anything big at the next on that?
Oh yeah, we worked for several years down at Bannack's cabin. Yeah, there was this Potawatomi Wildlife Park he's talking about is in Marshall County, and there's a native person there named Stephen Bannack that lived there, and he's documented quite a bit. Yeah, we worked at his cabin site, which was pretty. They had a Boy Scout camp there, but there had been a trailer there, and somebody dug a big hole and put a house trailer in it and totally messed up the site. Which I just think in 1,000 years that'll be such a cool find, a whole house trailer. But now it's like a pain in the neck, right? So Yeah, we worked there and we found his stuff, and later, he was one of those, he had a big land reservation. He was married. The reason we worked at this McCarthy's cabin in Kosciuszko County was his daughter was married to McCarthy. So McCarthy was a fur trader that also married a Native American woman, but he was American, so I didn't talk about him.
Have you gone to the slopes of the Wabash over there yet? Or?
No.
My friend of mine, he's like on the border there for the forts. And his wife's ready to Richardville and all that. So.
Yeah, I've never been up that far up. Yes, you and then you.
So I'm actually a volunteer interpretive naturalist at Indiana Dunes State Park.
Oh, okay. So you may have some more information than I have even.
So, and I actually I wrote and give the program on what we call the Battle of the Dunes, which is the little revolutionary incident that letter describes. And,
this is a speaker's worst nightmare. Somebody in the audience that actually knows something about it. Go ahead.
Well, so what I say in that is, because there were some writers that tried to make Petite Fort in the early 20th century sound bigger than it was.
Yeah, right.
And I would say it was probably a cabin with a wooden fence around it.
I think that's probably right.
That's probably right?
Yeah, that's what I think of it as too. Yeah.
And we always say probably somewhere around the mouth of Dunes Creek, but to tie in the nature, we always talk about the shifting nature of the dunes that you mentioned, and that the site may well have blown away over the past 150.
Oh, could be. Yeah, definitely.
But the creek is no longer under the parking lot.
Okay.
They daylighted it between 2005 and 2012, so it now flows freely into Lake Michigan again.
Okay. Have to go walk that creek bed.
Yeah, but some of the parking lot's still there, but the most effective part is gone.
Yeah. Okay. So yet another layer of alteration.
We've time for one more.
Wait, Gordon, I guess, had his hand up.
All right.
One of the last slides you showed was about 1790 to 1840. The removal period being named 1840. 1795, was that still more of a French influence or the English?
Well, this would be part of, by 1795, this would be part of the U.S., United States. So I call this removal period, the period between 1795 to 1840. It starts off with the Treaty of Grenville, signed in 1795. And that was the first treaty where Native Americans, this was the old Northwest Territory, right, which was Native territory. That was the first treaty where natives that resided in this area ceded land to the U.S. government. And to me, that starts off the process that's going to lead to removal. And so they gave land to the U.S. government. Some of that land, places where the U.S. could have forts and other stuff, and so that became non-native land. So I see that as the start of removal. But then through this whole period, into the 1840s and maybe later, 50s, Native Americans gradually see their land base shrink, and they get moved out of the area, for the most part. Except like the Pokagon Band is a prominent example, or Bannock, who stayed behind. Is that, okay.
All right, Tim, make it quick.
Okay, so I've done some X-ray fluorescence. Michael and I did it on some pottery. We had some pottery that was supposedly from different people and had different temper in it. And then we ran the samples through, looking for, if the temper's different, the matrix would be different. It's part of the idea. And we thought we would get different measurements, but it was chaos. So everything was just like, even multiple takes from a Schurr to produce different results. So you mentioned something like, I don't know what would happen, or you weren't sure what would happen if you took multiple points from one piece. Would it be the same? I suspect it would be very close and much more consistent than compared to the pottery matrix of how many different things are in clay. So what do you think? Do you feel confident about XRF? Would it work on other things?
It worked on, it's going to be easier if you have something that has a homogeneous composition, right? So it's like a piece of metal. Pottery's always probably going to be more, like modern pottery, very consistent, probably work really great on that. As potteries like early industrial pottery, or especially prehistoric pottery, a lot of different stuff in there, not sourced from the same area, a lot of different tempers and minerals. I mean, that's a lot more complicated thing. I think it's just, it depends on the nature of the pottery you have.
I would describe the data as nonsense.
Was this like historic?
What's that?
Was this historic pottery?
No,
Prehistoric?
Low-fi earthenware, right? Low-fi earthenware?
yeah.
Oh yeah, that's going to be really difficult. I've had zero success with that too. Okay,
All right. Well, thank you so much.
thank you. Thanks, thanks so much.
So thank you everyone for coming out and joining our lecture series. It was put on with the Niles History Center, the Niles District Library, and sponsored by WNU's IAS, the Institute for Intercultural and Anthropological Studies. So we really appreciate that you came out and celebrated each week with us. Now, next, not this weekend, but the next weekend, please all come out to the Archaeology Open House, so August 2nd and 3rd from 10 to 4. We'd love to show you what we're finding. There are a lot of students here who can give you a little bit of information afterwards to entice you to come out and visit, and hopefully people online will help.